So we're going to start off with the Native Plant Society, Gila Native Plant Society election. And this year it's for our officers. And we have a fine collection of nominees. And Margie Gibson for president, Mary Barrett for vice president, Betty Spence for secretary. And that will be her second, third, fourth, ninth term, I'm not sure. And Dave Becker for treasurer. Our bylaws but want us to ask for additional nominations from the floor. So are there any, and what you can do is use the chat room. Use the chat room for voting, but if you have nominations for any of these other candidates that aren't on this list, realizing that they must be present and they must agree to serve. So are there any nominations from the floor for any of the 4 office positions? Usually Robert's Rules of Order demand that you say that 3 times. Are there any nominations from the floor for president, vice president, secretary, or treasurer? Please use your chat to make your wishes known.
And a little extra time because it's a chat.
Can anyone do the Jeopardy? Do, 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 do. Are there any nominations from the floor for president, vice president, secretary, or treasurer? Please use the chat and let your wishes be known ASAP. Pat McLeod says she's not hearing the speaker. Are other folks hearing the speaker? John, you hear us? Yeah. Betty, you hear us? Yes, 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 yes. Okay, thank you. So seeing no nominations from the floor, I'm going to suggest that we vote in one fell swoop for President Margie Ann Gibson, Vice President Mary Barrett, Secretary Betty Spence, Treasurer Dave Becker. So if you agree that those 4 folks should be on our leadership team, please use the chat and say yes. If you don't want them, just say no. Please begin voting.
That's working very nicely. The votes are coming in a lot faster than Arizona's.
That's right.
Okay. Is there a certain amount of time we have to spend doing this, dear?
So all the votes in so far are yes, and it's slowed to a trickle.
It's a lot of votes.
I would say that our slate of candidates for leadership has passed. Our 2022 changes to the GNPS bylaws. We don't change the bylaws very often, but all of the members at least twice were sent all of the bylaw changes. And so we're going to assume that you have read those. And I'm going to ask you now to vote yes if you want to accept the changes to the bylaws of 2022, or vote no if you do not. Please vote now on chat.
That's a very positive group.
So seeing lots of yeses
Shall I vote too?
and no nos, we'll accept the bylaw changes. Thank you. Okay, well, let's stop our share. John, you can share. We've got 36 folks on chat. That's an excellent number. Realizing that many of you are in pairs. So that's a great turnout.
Okay, are you going to?
Yep. All right. It looks good on our end, John. I'm going to introduce you. So John Gorey received his bachelor degree in wildlife biology from Murray State University in 2008. And since graduating, he spent 14 years as a wildlife biologist studying birds, insects, plants, and habitats across the U.S. from Alaska to Maine and many places between. And I think the many places in between are really fascinating. I mean, they're in Peru, everything. So wait, who told? Nobody told me they were going to whatever. Anyway, Costa Rica. So excellent. And his wife Emily Pollum, they're a great pair of professional biologists, and they prefer to be in the field. And who doesn't? Anyway, since moving to New Mexico in 2017, he has focused his research efforts on southwestern New Mexico, and that is all to our advantage. So please welcome John Gorey.
All right. Thanks, Don, for the introduction. I'm going to try and keep this presentation around 40 minutes so we have plenty of time for questions at the end. But I'll just jump into it here. So many of you might be wondering how I came across this plant, and I was out doing invasive plant surveys for Heart of the Gila, and I decided to test myself and say I'll see how many thistle species I can find on this backpacking adventure. And I found 3 or 4, and then I took the trail down Iron Creek Mesa, and I saw this dark thistle in front of me. Almost looked black from a distance, and when I got up close, I noticed that it was essentially all purple. And so I used my Native Plant Society thistle guide, actually, the one that Robert Savinsky put together. And I found out it was Graham's thistle. And the description for the thistle said, a rare plant in New Mexico, has only been collected 3 times, only known from an area between the West and the Middle Fork, which is where I was. And so I decided I better count these plants. There's quite a few of them. And so I counted those, and then I had to move on with my trip. And about 2 days later, in a different drainage, I came across this is Turkey Feather Spring, and I found a couple hundred more Graham's thistle. And so then I decided that I would have to try and get some funding and see if this thistle really is rare, because I had found it in 2 locations in such a short amount of time. And luckily, the Native Plant Society of New Mexico did fund that effort, and that's why this presentation exists. So this is Turkey Feather Spring. This is the Graham's thistle here. Another part of my project initially was to do some studies on the Sacramento mountain thistle, which is Cirsium grahamii, and unfortunately that was contingent on a bumblebee project I was trying to get funded that would get me over in that area for a large portion of the summer. But I did get over there for 4 or 5 days on a butterfly project, and I came across a really big stand of the Sacramento mountain thistle, and it's really such an odd plant. You can see here, it doesn't look anything like a thistle you would see around here. They're about, some of them are 9 feet tall. They grow in these really unique wetland seeps that just pour out of the rocks. So it's almost like a prehistoric dinosaur in appearance. And if you end up getting over to the Sacramento Mountains, I highly recommend looking for this thistle. It's really beautiful. This is a Hunt's bumblebee pollinating the thistle. But just to cover some basics, what is a thistle? And so they're in the tribe Carduiae, and that's part of Asteraceae, which is, you know, the biggest plant family. And they belong to these 3 genera, Cirsium, Cardus, and Onoportum. And Cirsium is the genus that we have in North America, except for a couple of invasive Cardus species. And this is actually one of them here on the right. This is the musk thistle. And this was actually up on Bursum Road. So they are in the Gila, not very many spots. And then you have Onoportum. That's mostly Africa, Europe, Asia. Same with Cardus. And Cirsium is actually in the Old World as well. And one thing that we always think of when we think of thistles is they hurt. You probably remember stepping on them as a kid and learning pretty quickly that you didn't want anything to do with them. And for that reason, a lot of other plants that aren't true thistles have thistle in their common name, like sow thistle, star thistle, and they do share that spiky quality, but they're not actually true thistles. And there's quite a bit of variation in even individuals in a species of thistle, and sometimes that can make it difficult to identify them, especially in herbariums. I feel like in the field around here, it's fairly straightforward, but you always find an oddball that you can't quite key out. And so you just have to call it a Cirsium SP. But so a lot of people know about bull thistle, which I will talk about in a little bit here, but that's an invasive thistle from Europe that has a lot of negative effects on certain ecosystems. And if you're trying to remove bull thistle, make sure you know your thistles, because if you're killing native thistles, then there's really no point in killing the bull thistle. You might as well keep something out there to pollinate. And so I'll just go over these quick slides about parts of the thistle. But so the flower head here is made up of florets. They're all just these little micro flowers that have male and female parts, and these are where the pollination occurs. There's an ovary at the bottom where the seed is formed, and they erupt out of this cup-shaped thing here called an involucre, and it's made up of these spiny filaries. And if you try to identify thistles, you're going to see this terminology quite a bit. Here's a leaf coming out of the top here. A lot of them hug the stem quite a bit, or actually wrap around the stem. It's known as decurrent leaves. And then the stem, of course. And this is Graham's thistle here. So you can see it's got this purplish pink inflorescence on the top and this very dark involucre. And it's the only thistle you'll find in this area that has a purple involucre. So it's very identifiable. Every other species, it's more of a green color. And here's kind of a close-up view of the florets. And you can see here, you've got the corolla throat here. This is where pollinators are probing their proboscis for nectar, pollen. I don't cover the other ones. You know, this is actually a little pollen beetle in here. But so where is Graham's thistle? And so it's mostly in Arizona, and then in the U.S. it's mostly in Arizona, and then the largest populations are actually in the Sierra Madres in Mexico. It goes as far south as Durango, actually. But in Arizona, you have the Santa Catalinas, the Huachucas, Chiricahuas. I've seen reports from Mount Graham, but then other people say it's not there. So that's seems like it should be there. Shares the same name at least. But the closest population we have to New Mexico is, at least where we are, is the Apache Sitkers up here just west of Alpine. And then you've got this little section over here, and Iron Creek Mesa and Turkey Feather Creek. And then I put this little red spot off to the side because I found on iNaturalist after my survey, someone had seen some Graham's thistle in the one spot that I basically hadn't hiked in the last 2 years. So I'll have to get out there and actually see how big that population is. And so I'm just going to cover a few thistles that grow nearby the Graham's thistle populations. This one is our only yellow thistle. A lot of people stick with the Perry's thistle, Maine, which is Cirsium grahamii, but other people think that it's been, well, consider it the Gila Wilderness to be a separate species, and it only grows in the Mogollons. But there's not really a great way to identify them in the field. They only have one flower per stalk. That's one of the key identifiers. But then I found this one up here. This was on Mogollon Baldy, over 10,000 feet, and it looks completely different, probably because of the elevation and the rough weather. But you can see just the variation between plants it can be quite extreme, and so you might not know what you're looking at. But if you see a yellow thistle, it's most certainly a Perry's thistle, and in this area in the Mogollons, it's probably a Gila thistle. And so this is Wheeler's thistle, and this grows as close to the Graham's thistle populations as any other thistle besides bull thistle. And it's got this nice pink inflorescence here. It's much pinker, a lighter pink. The involucre is green, and it has phyllaries with very straight spines that stick out to the side. And they have these waxy, almost much darker, but waxy or shinier leaves here on the rosettes. And actually rosettes, I should cover rosettes. So most of our thistles are biennial. And so the first year, they come up as these rosettes. And so they just put out as much foliage as they can, basically like a satellite dish. And they just want to soak up as much sun as they can to store in their roots. For the second year, when they push up their flowers, and those flowers are just jam-packed with nectar and nutrients, and that's why they're such great pollinator plants, because not only do they grow in disturbed areas that other plants don't do well, but they have 2 years to just store up all that energy. And so every insect and every member in the wilderness wants a piece of the thistle. So this is Wheeler's thistle. It grows right on the edge of the wetlands that the Graham's thistle grows in. And so this is bull thistle. I don't have any flowering pictures, but it's the only thistle that grows in direct competition with Graham's thistle. And you can see just how dark green the foliage is, and it's just this giant mass of almost sinister looking spiny leaves. And this first picture here, you can see this light green rosette here. That's Graham's thistle. It's actually kind of being engulfed by the bull thistle. And so a big part of my project was making sure I remove all the bull thistle from this habitat and anywhere I found it on the forest. That was part of my work with part of the Gila. And so those are the 3 main thistles you'll see in proximity to Graham's thistle. And this is Graham's thistle right here. And I've already covered that it's got this nice purple involucre, but it has a very nice red stem too. It doesn't always come all the way up to the involucre, but I took this close up of the underside of the leaf. It's very tomentose, very thickly haired on the bottom here with these like interlocking hairs. And if you dare to touch the plant and you turn the leaf over, you'll see this like very silvery sheen, and it's this like cobweb hairs that you see there. And these are more Graham's thistles. You can see that this is a further away shot of the underside of the leaf. Sometimes you only get this purple color on the base of the stem. And before the thistle actually blooms and pushes out your florets, it's actually green. And the central ridge, which is usually purple, is white. So if you see something like this, even though it's not purple, it may be a Graham's thistle if you're in the right habitat. And so when I was counting plants, I counted rosettes and I counted flowering plants. So I had to learn what all of the different species looked like in their first year form. And so all of these little light green spiky plants you see are first year Graham's thistle. So this picture here has probably 30, maybe even more first year plants. And this is actually what they look like on the left here when they come up. This is like their first shoot for the year, and you can see there's no spines. They're very, very faint spines. It almost looks like a piece of lettuce. It's very hard to discern. There's actually another plant that looks pretty similar to this that doesn't have spines. That's a different plant. So it was time consuming to count all of these guys. And sometimes things don't go the way they should. Graham's thistle is supposed to have one flower per stalk, but in this case, it's almost like 2 stalks fused, or it was damaged somehow. And so this plant actually got 2 on 1 stalk. But I only saw this once or twice, pretty rare. And so I'll just cover what I did with the project. And so I spent 8 days, covered 90 survey miles. That's just like zigzagging through proper habitat off trail. The initial plan was to go out in July, August, and September. And so I went out in July, and the plants, the thistle was barely in bloom. I think there were only 2 specimens that had flowers, and so it was a bit early in mid-July. And then my next plan was to go out in mid-August, and that I was actually out getting ready to go out there, and I looked at the weather, and that happened to be the week that we got our torrential rain, like 6 inches or something, so I had to delay it. Ended up breaking my ribs during that time, so I couldn't go out in August, but I did make it out in September, and I think I was able to cover what I wanted to for the year. I really had to work hard in September though. But it would have been great to get out in August, especially for observing your pollinators and insects, because August is kind of the peak month for insects in New Mexico. But I wanted to mention also, I did about over 300 miles of hiking on trails for Heart of the Gila. I was lucky enough to do that, and that during that time I was looking for Graham's thistle as well. And so while that wasn't directly part of this project, that data was important for deciding where to go. And so on my surveys where I did find Graham's thistle, I counted these 10-meter circles, and I would just count the number of flowering plants and the number of rosettes, just to get a count of the individual species or the individual thistles in the area. I also inspected them for weevil threats, which I will go into later. and I recorded what wildlife is using the plants. And so this is actually a map of all of the ground I covered in the last 2 years, mostly for Heart of the Gila, but up here in the top left, this section here is where I covered my 94 miles. So I'm sure as many of you know, the Gila is a huge place, and even with satellite imagery and the time to hike, it takes a long, long time to cover ground, and especially off trail. So, but I think I covered, at least half of the trailed areas. And I think that since I had found populations in Iron Creek Mesa and Turkey Feather Creek, I really wanted to focus my efforts in this spot up here, which is very close to Willow Creek, if you're familiar with that. And so what is good Graham's thistle habitat? And at least in the Gila, there's no Graham's thistle unless you have wet, damp soil. And the low slope goes along with that. The lower the slope, that means the water is not going to flow off too quickly. In a lot of these drainages, as soon as the slope of the drainage increased, you wouldn't see any more Graham's thistle, and it's most likely because the soil was drying out quicker in those areas. They like these open meadows, and they really prefer low to moderate disturbance, and I'll cover that in a minute here, but without any disturbance, you get this. If you can look at this picture here, you've got this big mass of kind of dead looking grass. These are grasses and sedges, and there's no Graham's thistle out here, and it's because there's no space for it. They need a disturbance to provide habitat, and all of the populations that I found were right around 8,000 feet. The ones that were lower were usually just little satellite populations that only had a dozen individuals, and probably those populations will blink in and out. For whatever reason, that particular spot probably has the right amount of low slope and moisture to provide a habitat for them. And this is Iron Creek in mid-July, so the plants really haven't even come up yet. This is their preferred habitat. This is also Iron Creek, but you can see how much more narrow this section of the meadow is, and this is where the bulk of all of the plants I found are. You can see these dead trees. Because it's narrow, they're able to fall into the wet areas, and they create a disturbance when they do that. They also slow down water flow on the surface, and that provides an excellent habitat for the plant. And so about the disturbances, I mentioned these logs falling over. You can see this dead tree fell over here, and you've got all this Graham's thistle that's just jumped on that opportunity to sprout out of this tiny area that this log is disturbed. And another very important disturbance maker is the pocket gopher, actually. In the areas where I had the densest thistle, there was almost always these mounds from the pocket gopher. And the gophers aerate the soil. They potentially eat competitors, but they create these disturbances that aren't so severe that other plants might come in and outcompete the thistle, and so they really thrive. You can see them just like right around the edges of these gopher mounds. This is another example. Tree fell over. The water was actually pooling right around the base of this root system here. And this is in early July when most of the plants had not flowered, and this is the biggest Graham's thistle I saw all year. It was almost blooming when none of the other ones were up, just because this was such a an excellent habitat for it. And there's probably 8 or 9 Graham's thistle right in this spot here. And so this is a map of the area where the areas that I found the thistle. And so up here you've got Willow Creek. This is Iron Creek Mesa up here with all these red dots, and down at the bottom is Turkey Feather Creek. And so total population, I counted 4,023 individuals. And this is kind of a density map. You can see it's really dense down here, Turkey Feather Spring, and then we'll zoom in on these guys. But Iron Creek population, about 2,300 individuals. You can see this white area here. That was that grassy sedge area. And you can see there's no plants in that meadow. And that actually went for all these other white areas. They're also meadows, a lot of them very similar to the Iron Creek area. And those were also overgrown. They didn't have the disturbance. They were too wide. They weren't getting trees falling in them. There were no gophers, and there was no thistle. But I crossed over this ridge here, and I ended up finding this small population here, this Iron Creek East, which is a little over 600 plants. So that was the new population I found with the project. And here's another density map here. You can see they just really love this narrow strip here. And as soon as it gets to this dense grassy area, nothing. Same up here. And this Iron Creek East didn't have that narrow strip, but it had a nice little bit of habitat right here that had a lot of tree falls and a lot of good gopher action. This is the Turkey Feather Spring, and this is actually the densest area for the plant, and it's not a very big area. You can see there's also these little satellite groups down here, but that's only 20 individuals, but around 750 in this spot right here. And we'll zoom in on that. And so this 10-meter circle here, this big one, had over 250 individuals in one 10-meter span. And an interesting note about this Turkey Feather Creek population, they tended to be a lot darker purple, and the involucre was squatter, and they aligned a lot more with what we read for the key for Graham's thistle. And that makes me wonder, if you did genetics on this population and the one in Iron Creek, if there's some sort of hybridizing in the Iron Creek population. And this may be like more of a true Graham's thistle over here in Turkey Feather. And this is actually one of the Turkey Feather thistles here. You can see how much darker purple it is. And this one's not super squat, but a lot of them over there, they're just like straight out of the plant key. They're just like perfect examples of Graham's thistle. And so the other part of my project was I was looking at what kind of wildlife was utilizing the Graham's thistle. And luckily I got there in September when it was still warm. If I had gotten there in August, I think this page would be like unrecognizable. But there were just tons and tons of pollinators. And this is kind of just an overview of the things I saw, but the flower head, where all of the pollen and the nectar is, bees, wasps, butterflies, flies, beetles, goldfinches eat the seeds in the fall and the winter. Birds use the thistle down to line their nest. With the leaves, there were painted lady caterpillars all over the leaves, grasshoppers, leaf mining flies, probably as well as moths. These involucres actually contain a lot of sugars, and so there's lots of aphids on those, and then there's ants tending the aphids. There's leaf hoppers on the stems and also on the involucres. And then the stem provides a home for bees, weevils, moth larvae. I wasn't cutting down the plants, so I didn't actually get to see that, but I assume they're in there. And this is kind of, I'm not going to read all of this, but this is an overview of what I saw, species that were utilizing the plants while I was out there, and had likely 6 species of bumblebee, 28 species of butterfly, not that many moth species, but I was usually so tired at the end of the day I didn't spend a whole lot of time at night, but I did flush some. White-lined sphinx moths were very common. Hummingbirds, broad-tailed hummingbird, black-chinned hummingbird, even had an Arizona tree frog that was, I'm not sure if he was eating insects off of the plant or he just liked the protection of the leaf, but he seemed right at home on that spiky leaf. And this is kind of a typical image. Almost every thistle had at least 5 or a dozen species on it at one time. And so you've got your Sonoran bumblebee, soldier beetles, which are great pollinators, plant bug, which is actually what the group is called, and then these little pollen beetles here. And I saw this thistle here, and I saw that it was, it hadn't quite pushed its florets out and opened up all the way. And I was going to get a picture of that. But then I noticed all sorts of movement on this involucre here. And I zoomed in. I have a pretty good macro lens. And you can see all of these aphids, and they're drinking fluids out of the filaries here, or around the filaries, and these ants are actually tending the aphids, and the aphids, they actually turn what they drink into honeydew, and in return for protection of the ants, they provide that honeydew to the ants. And so essentially these ants are farming the aphids. And this is actually a picture of one of these ants moving. They actually, while I watched them, they moved these aphids around to better grazing areas. And aphids are, I had no idea how interesting aphids were, but after trying to figure out what species this was and failing miserably, they reproduce in really interesting ways. A lot of times they do a thing called parthenogenesis, where essentially only females exist, but they are able to reproduce and even reproduce males, and it's kind of a complicated process, but this species in particular actually does produce males and females. And so when a flower becomes overpopulated and they want to move to a different flower head, or the plant they're on is dying, they produce a version of themselves that can fly, so that they'll produce a male and a female. And this is actually one right here on the right. And so this is an adult reproductive form of those aphids, and this aphid probably is going to lay an egg and start a new colony on this plant here. And this is actually, you can see the real nice purple central ridge on these filaries. And this was my initial thought when I was looking for one of those thistles that was just starting to open up. And this one doesn't have any aphids, but you can see it's still green, still has a whitish central ridge, but as it opens up, it'll turn purple. These are more of the pollen beetles. You've got a little spider in here that actually mimics the same color as the throat of the flowering structures, probably so that pollinators come in, think they're sticking their proboscis in a flower, and it's actually a spider. And this was another really interesting aspect of nature that I didn't even really know knew existed. This is a blister beetle, a very small species, and when I figured out what species it was, I found this word triungulans, and I didn't really know what that was, but what this beetle does is it lays its eggs in the flowers or on the stem of the plant, and they hatch into triungulans, and that's the first life stage of this beetle, and its sole purpose is transportation. And what it does, this isn't my image, but they wait on the flower head for a pollinator to come, and they attach themselves, they jump on its back, and when the pollinator leaves to lay eggs or put the pollen with the eggs, they jump off and they feed on the eggs themselves, and that's how they progress to an adult blister beetle. So kind of a cruel world, but it's amazing that that's been selected for and that nature even thought that up. It's pretty crazy. As I mentioned, there were a lot of butterfly species. This day in particular, I think I had over 20 monarchs. Some of those maybe are on their way to Mexico. Other ones, painted ladies, which actually lay their eggs on the thistle. This Nokomis fritillary is a really cool butterfly. Most of the fritillaries you see around the wilderness are northwest fritillaries, but this is a species that is known from the Gila but isn't reported that often. This is a female, actually. I'm sure a lot of you saw these this year with all of the rains that we had. This is a white-lined sphinx moth. This is in September, but I remember seeing just tons and tons of them in June, and I think they probably had 2 or 3 generations this year. Just a huge explosion of this moth this year. We've got some more soldier beetles. And so I just want to quickly talk about the threats to this population, because this is only 3 sites, and so they're prone to basically blinking out. They are in neighboring Arizona, but we don't have very many in New Mexico. And I think probably the biggest concern for me would be like a catastrophic wildfire that actually torched these meadows at a high enough temperature that it could maybe destroy the seed bank or just change the geography enough that they're not good drainages anymore. Climate change, of course, these are kind of at the upper level elevation they can be right now, and so if things get hotter, they don't have much further up they can go elevation wise. Hybridization I will talk about in a minute, but disease and infestation. Through hybridizing, sometimes if you change the genetics of a plant, they become more prone to disease. Infestation by weevils, I'll talk about that in a second too, but bull thistle, while I did remove it, you can see here on the right, this is a big bull thistle growing next to, you can see in the distance, there's a little Graham's thistle, and they can outcompete the Graham's thistle, but in all of the locations I surveyed, the bull thistle wasn't really taking hold. And by me removing it, I hope it stays that way. Another issue that luckily has not happened as well is feral cows and horses. On other forests, they've caused a lot of problems in meadow ecosystems. These ecosystems are really fragile, and we don't have very many of them. So just a couple years of cattle or horse in a meadow ecosystem can completely change it and potentially, eradicate a species like this. So but I will talk about the hybridizing. So the good things, well, first of all, thistles, they have all of these florets and they're constantly being pollinated by insects that have pollen from other individuals, other species, and so they're constantly being exposed to genetic material that can, produce viable offspring. And it doesn't happen all the time, but hybridizing occurs in thistles pretty regularly, and the genetic diversity of that can be beneficial. But in other studies where they've looked at small populations of rare thistle, and you have this other non-rare thistle that is much more abundant, and it's essentially imposing its genes on these small populations, they can have very detrimental effects where they essentially push out the rare species or pass on traits to those that are not beneficial for that plant in that ecosystem. And so I think it would be great to do some genetic work with these plants just to see, are they already hybrids? In Arizona, there's the Graham's thistle, and the Apache cichlids often hybridizes with Perry's thistle. I didn't see any signs of that with these populations, but there is Perry's thistle in our forest, so that's always possible. And another interesting thing I read in some papers was that after doing genetic work with most of the Cirsium species in North America, they believe that the Cirsium genus in North America is actually kind of a newcomer. I think it arrived around 7 to 9 million years ago. And so like the greatest amount of speciation in Cirsium has occurred in the last couple million years. And it's likely this Graham's thistle wasn't even here a few million years ago. This isn't, and so these plants are evolving quickly, and they're always evolving, of course, but when you have this radiation from an event like that, where maybe a stray seed from Europe or something somehow got over to North America 7 or 9 million years ago, they're finding these new areas and they're adapting to new habitats and creating new species. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Another aspect for my surveys is I looked for these 2 weevils, which can have negative impacts on populations of thistle. This Lixus pervistidis is a native species that lays its eggs on the stem of the plants, and Rhinocilus conicus was actually introduced to get rid of musk thistle, and it lays its eggs on the involucre, on the phyllaries, and the larvae hatch in the head of the flower, and both of these can cause failure in thistle populations. And I surveyed about 700 plants looking for the lesions and the egg stars, and happy to say that I did not see any damage. This is 2 species that they have trouble with in the Sacramentos, with the Sacramento mountain thistle. So doesn't look like we have them here in these Graham's thistle populations. And I'll just do this quick 2-minute video. It's kind of a live action shot of a lot of the pollinators, just so you can kind of see how they feed. that's just a little taste. If you end up getting out there, I mean, it's endless fun just watching all of the things that come into these thistles. And so that's it for the presentation, but I want to thank the Native Plant Society of New Mexico and the Jack and Martha Carter Conservation Fund for funding my efforts, the U.S. Forest Service for doing such a great job managing and maintaining the forest, the wonderful forest that we have just at our back door. And I wanted to thank Heart of the Gila for getting me out into the wilderness looking for invasives, because if I wasn't doing that, I wouldn't have found the thistle to begin with. So thanks to those people. And I also want to say this is a shout out to iNaturalist. If you don't know what it is, I'd be happy to explain it and show you how to use it. But it allows any person with a smartphone or a computer to make observations, and these observations can be used by scientists to do a lot of really great research. And it's fun too. You get to learn, people will ID your stuff, and you'll learn what you're seeing. And these are just some of my sources, but that is all.
Okay, John, thank you very much. Why don't you stop sharing, and then let's see who's here. And
Okay.
then I'd like to have I'm going to go through. There are a few questions that have come up on chat,
Sure.
and we'll take those. And I encourage people to keep asking questions on chat, no matter how complex or how simple. We have folks of varying levels of knowledge here, so let's get your questions answered. One of the things that I'd like to start off with, John, is how many different studies can you think of where you can write more grants to the Native Plant Society of New Mexico? I mean, it seems like you could finish out your career here with studies.
I mean, I can come up with more, that's for sure. I do love, going out and exploring and looking for things that haven't been seen in a long time. That's one of my favorite things to do. But.
Could you unshare?
Oh, yeah.
Stop sharing?
Yeah.
Very good. So let me take a look here. So on the chat room, okay, yeah. Let's see here. Jim McGrath had one a little bit earlier. Oh, how widespread do you think the population is beyond where you found it?
I mean, I don't doubt that there are maybe a couple more populations. There's not that much suitable habitat in that elevation range that also has a wet meadow ecosystem. I did mention that iNaturalist sighting was in an area that I did not get to. And that population doesn't look very big, but there's certainly Graham's thistle out there that I did not find. But I would have to think these are kind of the core areas in the Gila, more than likely.
Mm-hmm. Patrice Muchnick, bull thistle also loves disturbance, but it seems that Graham's thistle needs smaller scale disturbance. Can you comment on, I'm kind of losing it here, on any of the...
Oh, I think I see it, yeah.
Oh, can you comment on any additional particulars about the Graham's habitat?
I do agree that bull thistle does better with more extreme disturbance. That's one of the reasons I think if you had a widespread, like serious disturbance in this habitat, you might have an issue with bull thistle taking over. But since there's such a wide array of native plants already with a foothold in that ecosystem, the small scale disturbance really just benefits mostly the Graham's thistle. At least that's the way it seems.
And Patrice also asked, and is it likely that the populations will be ephemeral and moving?
It seems like they must have moved over time, like with wildfires, have been a part of this ecosystem for millions of years. These habitats can't stay in their current state forever. And so the fact that the seeds are wind dispersed, they must be able to reseed. They might even have a seed bank already out there in areas just kind of waiting for the habitat to change. So I think, in 1,000 years, these populations probably won't be in the same spot anymore.
So we have lots of folks thanking you, obviously. And Susan Price thanks you for sharing your research and giving her a new appreciation for this stickery but beautiful plant.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I didn't realize that I loved thistles so much. I remember, stepping on one as a kid and then kind of hating them until I became a biologist. And they're really just these magnificent plants that provide so much for the habitat they're in, for the insects. And this one in particular does grow in very specific habitat, but there's plenty of other ones like New Mexico thistle that you could just plant basically anywhere. You can throw the seed in your yard and you'll be bringing this abundant food source for pollinators.
Yeah, I've always found that the thistles are pollinator magnets. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering, John, did you find cattle in these habitats, in these wet areas?
No.
Yeah, and that maybe is why they're still there.
Yeah. Luckily, I did not see any cows, but trying to think. Yeah, I don't typically see too many cows even in the Willow Creek area, but I'm sure it happens from time to time. But at least the ranchers have done a good job at making sure their cows don't make it into the wilderness, which is probably a smart idea because you might never get them back. So
Yeah. Well, and then kind of a follow-up is it possible for the Forest Service to designate this area as a protected habitat because this is a rare species?
Potentially. And so it's kind of, I didn't talk about it in my presentation, but I should have. This species, this is the only spot it's known for in New Mexico. It used to be listed on a list of rare plants. It was taken off. I'm not exactly sure why, but I think it's from a lack of data and a lack of observation. They weren't sure probably if it was a hybrid like it is in Arizona and just how many there are. And so hopefully this will lead to some protection or at least some status of some sort.
I'd just like to say that this is recorded, so soon it will be up on our Gila Native Plant Society website, which is Wendy?
GilaNPS.org.
GilaNPS.org. And we try to get all of our presentations recorded. So something maybe earlier from Jim McGrath, it said that he has found Graham's thistle at Bear Wallow Park and also a single specimen at EWEU Canyon. And he thanks you for presentation. So that might be some.
Okay. Yeah. Bear Wallow, I did not get over there, but that's also a very similar habitat. So that's a great area to look for it.
Okay, I'm trying to get up here.
It does look like Patrice said that area is being considered as a special botanical area, Andy. So because not just because of this plant necessarily, but because of multiple species. So that might already be underway.
Yeah, well, that would be great. The cattle have done so much damage to so much of the forest that I'd hate to see it continue. So,
yeah.
And your study may help push them over the brink so they designate it that way.
Yeah,
so great job. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have a question? You can put up your hand or unmute and ask a question now. John, I'm always interested in, actually the whole Gila Native Plant Society and probably the whole Native Plant Society in New Mexico, very, very interested in these special plants that have this relationship, this evolutionary relationship with each other. And we're specifically looking at native plants that we can try to get folks to plant that have special relationships with some very specific pollinators and act as larval host plants. A lot of the grasses are very important for the caterpillars of various species of butterflies, and skippers in particular seem to be really fond of grasses. And as we lose our native flora, then we lose those species that are intimately tied. In some cases, they'll only, some of these pollinators will only be attracted to flowers and plants of a specific family or a specific genus. And it's just amazing how much we don't know. So any comments on that, John?
I think it is one of the areas in science, especially in pollinator science, that's lacking is what plants do particular insects use. And that's something anybody can do. Just the flowers around your house, especially the native wildflowers, if you see something pollinating, that's a great thing to put on iNaturalist. And we're able to learn what plants they use, because if you look at a lot of information for moths, butterflies have mostly been figured out, but we don't even know, like half of the larval food plants for all of the moth species. we might be able to name the moth, but we don't even know what plant it's utilizing. And so that's a great contribution that you could have for science as a citizen.
So what would be interesting is that you're so tired because you're hiking miles and miles a day, and you're doing your field work, and you're in the sun and the wind and rain this year. Maybe you need to get in your tent, have a good sleep during the day, and then get your lights, traps and stuff like that, and get out there and start looking at some of these moth species that are, we love the butterflies. Mm-hmm. But the moths are as important, maybe more important. I don't know. It's just that
only like 3% of Lepidoptera are butterflies. The rest are moths. So
yeah,
they make up a huge number.
Yeah, so we're missing a lot, and I love the charismatic megafauna and microfauna, but I'd like to see more on those moths, and so sometime maybe we'll do a light trapping,
for sure,
field trip at night, and just let folks know the diversity of pollinators that are there at night, and maybe we can do something on those plants that we can plant as members that attract night pollinators, plants that open at night. And of course, we haven't even started talking about the bats. So anyway, there's...
Yeah, I will say, there is a nursery that sells Graham's thistle in Arizona. I can't remember the name of it. So theoretically, you could plant this around where you live. I'm not sure how well it would survive. At least in the Gila, it has a very particular habitat that it's successful in, and so I can't imagine it would do well at my house. But maybe if you have a lot of water, you could make it work. But otherwise, plant, New Mexico thistle or Arizona thistle, or one of the thistles that does really well in an arid environment. So.
The current president of the Native Plant Society of New Mexico, Tom Stewart, had a professor by the name of Martin, and the Martin's thistle is named after him, and I collected some seeds for him. So there are a lot of species of thistle, and we, as you said there, that I don't know if in Cirsium, if most, not all, but most of them are biennials. Yeah, so you see that basil rosette on the ground, let it go, because next year when that second year comes up, it's fast and furious.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's an incredible plant. I mean, it's so useful for pollinators. So never destroy one. But it's fun. This spring, actually, I went along the roadsides where there's a lot of New Mexico thistle and a couple other species, and I just gathered seed and took them somewhere a little bit further away from the road, because it's fun to see them by the road, but all of those pollinator plants next to the road are just death traps, because the pollinators cross the road and they get hit. And so it's best if you can keep those, away from vehicles, because I'm sure a lot of you noticed this year with all of the rains, when all of the butterflies emerged, and you drove to Deming or wherever, and you were just killing hundreds of butterflies. If you can keep your pollinator plants away from vehicles, that's the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Margie, your face has just appeared and you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
No, it was a great presentation. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.
I'd like to congratulate you, Margie, on your election, president-elect, to the Gila chapter of the Native Plant Society of New Mexico.
Thank you very much.
And Dave Becker. Yes, I know.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, and that's good. But you'll be wonderful, and there's lots of help for you.
Yeah.
And Dave Becker, you're on tonight, and our new treasurer. And I know that Betty is here, and she'll continue as secretary. And Mary Barrett.
She's there.
Okay, so Mary, you're there you are. Congratulations on your vice presidential win. I'm hoping that we don't have recounts or any vote rigging, but I think we're good. If this is your last chance, folks, questions for John. Just unmute and speak. Okay.
Great presentation, John.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was a great presentation.
Yeah, and so we'll keep those applications in for Native Plant Society of New Mexico grants, and keep working on this.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Good night.
Can we go upstairs?